So with that, I am done with my little virtual speech. Thank you all for being here in person. Thank you all for being here on Zoom. I'm going to have Kelly Nee come up and give the official welcome. She is one of the forum organizers, the primary forum organizer, I would say. She's an executive director at RPS Ocean Science and has been with the forum since its inception. Thanks so much, Kelly, for joining.
Thanks, Anne, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's Climate Adaptation Forum. Looking at the attendee last night, I was really excited to see we have an equal number of virtual and in-person attendees, which might be the first time that's ever happened. So it's really, truly a hybrid event, and the team here works very hard to make this a high-quality experience for both our virtual attendees on Zoom and our in-person attendees. That is helped tremendously by the technology available in this room, so thanks very much to Nutter for providing the room to us. When we pick a location for these events, we're thinking about things like the technology setup, we're thinking about accessibility, we're thinking about cost. What we're not always mindful of is what's come before us in this place. And so I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that the land that surrounds us was inhabited by Native Americans and indigenous people for hundreds of years before Europeans arrived. This is reflected in the place names that we're all familiar with in this area: Massachusetts, Mattapan, Shawmut, Neponset. This land is historically, or is the territory of the Massachusetts, Pawcatuck, and their neighbors, the Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and Nankid peoples. They stewarded this land for hundreds of generations. Today, we recognize the repeated violations of sovereignty, territory, and water perpetrated by the colonizers. We extend our respect to the citizens of these nations and their ancestors and to all indigenous people. We also affirm that this acknowledgement is insufficient. It does not undo the harm done against indigenous people and their land and water. So just everyone take a moment to reflect on that. Okay, a little background about the forum. Whoa, too close to the mic. A little background about the forum today. Today's forum actually concludes our 6th year of climate adaptation forums, which is pretty exciting. Thank you. We've covered a pretty broad range of topics related to climate adaptation and resilience over the years. And our programming is guided by our steering committee, which is a group of 15 committed professionals. Our nomination process for next year just concluded, and we're just finishing up the notification process. So we're really excited to welcome our new members in September. I want to end by thanking all of the people that make these events possible. First and foremost, the EBC and their staff. We could not pull off these events without the likes of Jessamine and Stephanie. Also, the Sustainable Solutions Lab at UMass Boston. Gabriella is here with us today. And our steering committee, they're really important. They provide the thought leadership that goes into the forum. And we have a couple of members from the steering committee here in person today. We have Aaron, may come over the back, Julie, who will speak in a moment. I know I saw Lauren. Did I miss anyone else that's here in person? Nasser, Carolyn, you guys all registered after I looked at the attendee list. So thanks very much to the steering committee. They work very hard to chair these events. Next up, I do want to introduce today's chairs. Kathleen Brill, who's a partner at Foley Hoag, and Deanna Moran, who is the Vice President for Healthy and Resilient Communities at CLF. They're both longtime members of the steering committee, and they put together all of the thought and organization for today's event. I also want to thank all of our sponsors and supporters. We couldn't pull off these events without the support of our sponsors and our supporters. So thank you very much to all of those, and it is sponsorship season, so expect a phone call from me soon. And finally, I want to thank in particular Weston and Sampson and the New England Aquarium, who sponsor our virtual events. So I'm going to turn things over to Julie Eaton-Ernst from Weston and Sampson for a couple of quick remarks.
So I want to say welcome, everyone, and thank you guys for joining in today's Climate Adaptation Forum. Weston and Sampson is proud to sponsor the Climate Adaptation Forum and the important topics like today. We're already experiencing the effects of climate change, and while we globally and locally seek to dramatically curb our carbon emissions, we must also be working to adapt to the chronic and acute changes in our environment and the uncertainty of our future. The Climate Adaptation Forum brings together folks who are at the forefront of this effort from around the world to promote knowledge, sharing, capacity building, and networking. Over the past 6 years, as Kelly mentioned, the CAF has discussed a wide range of topics with diverse presenters. As the need for climate adaptation grows, so does the need for these types of collaborative spaces. While it may feel overwhelming and at times despair, one of the things I find the most beneficial about the Climate Adaptation Forum is the hope and sense of opportunity and the spirit that emanates from each forum. We're not alone with this crisis, and through networking and exploring topics like today's, that hope grows brighter and our path forward becomes clearer. So these forums require a lot of effort to be produced. Kelly gave some thank yous, and I want to also add thank yous to our presenters for coming today and sharing your expertise. And then thank you to everyone that's here in person and virtually for your participation today. You guys are the ones that are going to transform these conversations into action. So thank you guys for being here, being present, and thank you for your stewardship.
Thanks, Julie. And now I want to invite Luz Arrogas from the New England Aquarium, who I believe is going to give some virtual remarks this morning.
So the New England Aquarium is so proud to sponsor today's event. The aquarium is a nonprofit research and conservation organization that has protected and cared for our ocean and marine animals for more than 50 years. Decades of research and our location on Boston's waterfront have given us a unique perspective on the challenges presented by climate change. Today's forum topic is of particular importance. We are fortunate to live in a time where many incredibly talented minds have come together to study and analyze the current and future impacts of sea level rise, ocean acidification, pollution, and much more. We know that these threats are very real and present. But now is the time for action. We need to collaborate across sectors and industries to figure out how we can implement solutions in real time. I'm so thrilled to be here, joined by so many incredible speakers, and thank you all for being here both in person and virtually. And let's see what innovative next steps we can come up with together. Thank you.
And now I would like to welcome Brent McDonald from Nutter to welcome us to this space.
Good morning, all. My name is Brent McDonald, and I'm a member of Nutter, McLennan, and Fish's Environmental and Land Use and Development Practice Groups. On behalf of Nutter, I want to welcome those attending virtually, as well as those attending live at the Louis Brandeis Conference Center at Nutter. Nutter is proud of its longstanding support of the Environmental Business Council and the transformative work it does on behalf of the industry and its members, and certainly this long-running Climate Adaptation Forum. We want to thank the EBC, the forum chairs, the steering committee, the sponsors, and today's presenters for putting this program together, and also to thank the EBC for having a virtual option, which allows people like me to participate, even though I happen to be 3,000 miles from Boston this morning. So welcome all, and we hope you enjoyed today's Climate Adaptation Forum.
Thank you very much, Brent. And now I will turn things over to Deanna Moran, who will kick off today's forum.
Thanks, Kelly. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this quarter's Climate Adaptation Forum on Emerging Governance Structures for Climate Resilience. My co-chair for this forum, Kathleen, Brill, and I are really excited about the lineup of speakers that we have today. I think you probably would all agree that the issue of governance is really timely in Massachusetts, certainly, and also in our other New England states and across the country, as we attempt to take years' worth of climate data and climate adaptation plans and implement them. Funding is obviously a critical component of that implementation phase and one that gets a fair amount of attention. Governance gets a little less attention, but it really is the other kind of second critical pillar of implementing these plans. They're also really inextricably tied to each other. Once you have the funding, you've identified the mechanism, you have to have some mechanism to spend it. And we're increasingly identifying large-scale, district-wide, and regional solutions to climate risks like flooding. Coordinating these projects becomes, in some ways, even more challenging than identifying the funding to pay for them. It's exceedingly complex to implement climate resilience on a parcel-by-parcel or city-by-city scale. Fragmented property ownership, permitting requirements, funding, and political will make implementing these projects really hard and sometimes confusing. There's a number of other reasons why regional coordination of these types of projects is advantageous. including the fact that it's typically more equitable and more cost efficient than relying on each individual city or town to do this in a vacuum, which really requires them to rely on their own capacity and their own resources and put certain communities at a disadvantage to others. The lack of a regional approach to governance in New England and across the country is particularly glaring at this moment when there are so many federal resources available or becoming available, and very few of us have the right governance structure to leverage them. So that's the context that we're working in today. And in this program, you're going to hear from 5 incredible speakers from 5 different geographies with a really wide-ranging perspective on how to tackle governance for climate resilience, including some that are really on the leading edge of establishing new laws and authorities to help move these efforts forward. So with that, I'm thrilled to announce our keynote speaker, Senator Sarah Elfreth from Maryland. Senator Elfreth was first elected in 2018 as the youngest woman ever elected in the Maryland State Senate. She's worked with colleagues across the aisle and around the state to pass 84 bills in her first 5 years in office on a wide range of issues. She's one of 2 senators representing Maryland on the multi-state Chesapeake Bay Commission and works with her colleagues in Pennsylvania and Virginia to build consensus and implement policy solutions to protect and restore the Bay. She serves as the Senate Chair of the Joint Committee on Program Open Space and Agricultural Land Preservation, and also the Joint Committee on the Chesapeake and Atlantic Coastal Bays Critical Area. Senator Elfreth was instrumental in passing legislation that led to Maryland's new resilience authorities, something I know she's going to talk a lot about today. So with that introduction, I'll pass it over to Senator Elfreth.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the introduction. Thank you to our hosts and organizers. I'm so happy to be here and talk about resilience authorities and some other policy toolkits that I think have been working here, not here, I'm not in Maryland right now, working in Maryland that I think I know can be helpful for other states and jurisdictions. So if you wouldn't mind throwing up the presentation, I'd appreciate it. I really appreciate this picture. There's no citation on it because a friend of mine took it when I was first running for office in 2018 on one of our many sunny day flooding incidents in the city of Annapolis. And so you can see, he happened to be a professional photographer, which is why it's so beautiful. But you can see, I think, everything we have at risk and everything we could lose if we don't take any action today. So this is actually, if you're standing on the city dock in Annapolis, your back is actually to the water right now, and you're looking up, and you can see all of our small businesses along the city dock. Right behind there are historic residences. I actually live past the high watermark sign, so greedy self-interest, I want to solve this problem. And then you can see the State House in the background, and then the Naval Academy is going to be to your right. So tremendous infrastructure that's at risk if we don't take any action. If you can go to the next, oh, I can go to the next slide. Okay. So I think why we're here today is because climate change can feel so overwhelming. And it's not a surprise that folks can maybe freeze up a little bit when it comes to how we actually address this overwhelming crisis in our midst. And it's not when it's going to, if it's going to happen, it's when it's going to happen. My district experiences 50 to 60 sunny day flooding events every year. We had 2 tornadoes, a king flood, and a 16-inch snowstorm, all in about 18-month period 2 years ago. So it's happens to be happening in my district pretty frequently, and we have to do something. It needs to spur action. And in Maryland, at least, in the last 5 years, we've taken significant action. So today I'm gonna talk about establishing resilience authorities, which is the governance structure. But I also want to talk about the need to set ambitious policy goals and then to implement strategic policy tools around those ambitious goals. And then finally, what we can do to mitigate and respond to the impacts that we're experiencing. So I want to break it into some sizable, achievable bites for everybody here. Okay, so here's the inflection point in Maryland. We have 3,100 miles of shoreline because of the Chesapeake Bay. So significant, again, infrastructure at risk. My county has about 550 miles of shoreline to protect. From the data show that from 2000 to 2020, precipitation in Maryland increased by 2.63 inches per decade, overwhelming a lot of our built infrastructure. We also know the Northeast Atlantic region saw 100 to 150% more flood days in 2020 than in 2000. And the most startling fact here is our projected sea level rise in the bay, projected to go up to 2.1 feet by 2050. So that's all we have at risk. Maryland is constantly cited as the second or third most vulnerable state when it comes to sea level rise. Thankfully, Florida beats us in that. We hate to lose to Florida, but we'll take this one as on the chin. So what do we do about it? This is one of the latest maps of our vulnerability in the Bay region. We obviously have some pieces of Virginia, Delaware, and New Jersey here. I like this because when you zoom out, you can see the crisis at hand. Now, my district is right in the middle. I can't point to it, but where it's kind of the brown that suggests that we are, shoreline is mostly protected. When you zoom in, you're going to be able to see that it's a lot of vulnerability across the board. But this also shows the vulnerability, particularly on Maryland's eastern shore, that blue section where shore protection is unlikely. It also shows where we have tidal wetlands. And we all know the importance of wetlands when it comes to being a natural barrier, a natural protector of our communities when it comes to fighting climate change. Another startling statistic is that the Chesapeake Bay is projected to lose 70% of our wetlands over the next 100 years. So that's another crisis that we need to be thinking about. So the solution here is not just gray infrastructure, it needs to be blue and green infrastructure as well. So a little more about the crisis at hand. And this map again shows that it's across the board, across political districts. This is my district. That's me at the boat show a couple years back. We see 50 to 60 days of nuisance flooding. Now, if you've ever been to the Annapolis Boat Show, and it's the U.S. Boat Show in Annapolis, you know that it's the most sacred thing in Annapolis. So when you see a nuisance sunny day flooding occur that almost shut down the boat show, that's pretty startling. But this occurs quite often across the district. In Ellicott City in Howard County, which is the right middle of Maryland, they saw 2 1,000-year floods in the course of 2 years, unfortunately leading to the deaths of 3 people and tens of millions of dollars in damage. Now, this was due to flash flooding. We know that, again, we're going to see rainfall that is unlike anything we've ever seen before in terms of intensity, but also some really poor overdevelopment policies over the years that led to everything flowing down into this river basin, which happens to be this historic city. They are rebuilding, they are rerouting the river in Ellicott City to make sure this doesn't happen again, to the tunes of hundreds of millions of dollars to do this. But we also see that it doesn't just impact necessarily communities on the coast. We see climate change impacting urban communities, really built communities. In Baltimore City, for instance, we know that there's an urban heat island effect where it's 10 degrees warmer in the city than in the surrounding suburbs. And these maps overlay the development with the heat, proving that this is truly an environmental justice issue, that we need to invest in blue and green infrastructure in these communities. And we were able to do that in this 2 legislative sessions ago, and I'll touch on that in a minute, but we need to always have an eye on equity and always have an eye on the environmental justice component as well as a solution. And the good news is that just like a watershed, climate change does not really respect jurisdictional political boundaries or political parties or who represents which district. That's good news in terms of finding a solution because we're able to bring folks together who might not otherwise agree on much. At least in Maryland, we have the Eastern Shore, which is predominantly represented by Republican senators and delegates. We see Dorchester County, which is incredibly low-lying already. It's expected that half of the county will be underwater by 2050, with saltwater intrusion that's already threatening wells and prime agricultural land. So this is also about our food security as well. So here are our advantages in Maryland. And I want to take you back in time, pre-federal infrastructure bill, if you could. Our advantages when we started this work, we have incredible mapping, a partnership between our Department of Natural Resources and NOAA to show them where we are most vulnerable. We have the maps, not necessarily a solution. We have incredible experts at the ready through the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science and the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Finance. So they are ready and willing to help. Our disadvantages, we have had no centralized strategy or coordinating across state government, across multi-departments, because we know that climate change solutions are going to require not just a response from our Department of Environment, Department of Natural Resources, but also our Emergency Management, Department of Health, Department of Transportation, and we have nobody kind of coordinating all of that work at the state level, let alone working with our local jurisdictions and coordinating multi-jurisdictionally. And then we have no mechanism to build the infrastructure needed to combat climate change. And we have very little strategy to invest in that blue and green infrastructure I talked about before. Now, this is if we can go back in time to 2018. So when my local jurisdiction came to me, this is the same city dock I showed you underwater a minute ago, with an idea that we want to raise the city dock, that we want to create a higher seawall. We want to take what is now currently a parking lot and create a green space. It's going to cost $45 million, which for a city, and Annapolis is a city of 40,000 people, their ability to bond is directly tied to their operating budget and the ability that they can take out debt and then pay that debt service over time. They're very limited in their debt capacity. So they have no ability to pay for a $45 million infrastructure project. And yet this is just one piece of one city in a state. So what can they do to actually build this and create a better space for everybody? Again, because it's a parking lot at the moment, it's not currently protecting against the rising seas. It's not bringing any kind of economic development beyond parking revenues, which are minimal. And it's not providing that green space. And it's also not providing critical public water access, which is also has to be a component of everything we're talking about today. So what can we do? That's the spark. The question, back to this picture, is how do we pay for that infrastructure required to save and build more resilient communities? And this is where we get wonky. Our solution was Senate Bill 457, Local Governments Resilience Authority's authorization, not the sexiest of titles for a piece of legislation, but it got the job done. I had an old professor in undergrad who would just massacre our papers in red ink and cross out and circle whole paragraphs and say, okay, but why? And I like to think about that a lot when I'm working on legislation. We have to be able to answer the okay, but why? And then we also have to answer the corollary, okay, but how? So I'm going to start with the okay, but why? And I'm not sure how necessarily it works in Massachusetts. In Maryland, you have the option of creating a preamble, which doesn't really have the substance of law. I mean, it's kind of flowery and nice. And if this bill was ever challenged in court, you know, it's a piece of the law, so a judge could actually review it as part of its legislative history, but it's really not that important. But we wanted to highlight why it's so important in Maryland that we take this action. So our flowery preamble that I did not write, but I'm very proud of. Whereas the impacts of climate change are happening now in communities across the state of Maryland, and whereas these impacts include rising temperatures, major rain and storm events, sea level rise, and changes in precipitation patterns, and whereas those things that Maryland communities depend on and value, natural resources and ecosystems, energy, transportation, agriculture, cultural and historic resources, human health, and economic growth, are experiencing and will continue to experience the effects of climate changes, and whereas communities in coastal states account for nearly half of the nation's population and economic activity, and that cumulative damage to properties in those areas could reach $3.5 trillion by 2060. And whereas local governments will bear much of the responsibility and cost required to mitigate the impacts of climate change through infrastructure investment, and whereas the resilience financing authorities can work in partnership with local governments to accelerate infrastructure financing, reduce the cost of implementation, and mitigate and manage the risks of climate change. Now, therefore, the how. So our goals of the legislation. It will enable counties and municipalities individually or jointly to form these resilience authorities. In Maryland, we require tremendous enabling legislation for our locals. They don't have the ability to, let's say, create a new tax. They don't have an ability to change election law, liquor law, anything like that, without the General Assembly enabling them to do it. So that's what this bill does. It enables them individually as a county, individually as a municipality, or jointly together to form these resilience authorities. It authorizes the authorities to issue bonds and serve as the vehicle to fund critical infrastructure. Again, when our local governments are very much restricted by their debt capacity, this allows them to create an entity separate and apart from their debt capacity so that they can actually finance these projects. And it allows localities to direct general fund revenues to resilience authorities. Again, essential. Most of our counties and municipalities in Maryland don't have the ability to dedicate general fund revenue to any source. So this enables them to do that. They actually needed the General Assembly to give them this power to do that. Okay, some definitions are really important here too. So we defined the fund of resilience infrastructure projects. We say that the RAs can fund these projects that could include flood barriers, green spaces, building elevation, and stormwater infrastructure that address the effects of climate change. And it defines these eligible projects as those that address sea level rise, nuisance flooding, increased rainfall, erosion, and temperature rise. This seems kind of boring, but at the same time, when we looked back in Maryland law, there was really no definition of climate change in our law. So we tried to build that out here as some of the impacts that our communities are experiencing. Local governments can have the flexibility of defining the size of and term of the board members of resilience authorities. The bill is intentionally broad. We didn't want to be over prescriptive with our localities and how they can form or what size or makeup or anything of the boards, but they had to have a board, but we're giving them the flexibility of how to do that. It's really important, and this was a selling piece of getting the bill passed, was that we needed to require some pretty stringent reporting requirements on the resilience authorities themselves. Again, if the General Assembly of the state of Maryland is giving away some of its power, especially on some projects that could, there could be a perception of greater risk for our localities. We wanted to make sure that we had annual reporting back. So the bill has annual reports back to the Senate and the House Committee on Environment and the Senate and the House Committee on the Budget. So we get those annual reports, and I'm happy in a follow-up to share the links to the reports that we have so far that have come in. Really important that we defined what resilience authorities are not. And again, this was a big piece of us getting the bill passed. They cannot raise taxes. Cannot raise taxes. This remains the sole discretion of that local governing body. So if it's a resilience authority formed for the city of Annapolis or for the city of Baltimore, the resilience authority itself cannot raise taxes, and that would remain with the city councils of both jurisdictions. And it cannot exercise eminent domain to expropriate private property for public use. Two really important points. When I run a bill, I like to put myself in the opposition's chair and listen to their arguments and then make sure that we can eliminate every one of their arguments in the bill itself. So this is our compromise to get the bill done. It does, as you can see in the call out here, they can charge and collect fees to back the bond issuances that they're taking out. But as you see, if it's underlined, that means it's an amendment. We amended in subject to the approval of the local governing body. So again, making sure that this is not a mini fiefdom, this is not a new government, a resilience authority board. Everything is still going to be subject back to those city councils or county councils in this case. So important to know what they are and they are not. Some advantages of resilience authorities. They exist outside of local government procurement processes, which are very important for folks who work in government. Maryland in particular, we have some procurement challenges. It's taking quite a long time to set an RFP out, to get responses back, to pick, and then to actually pay a lot of our contractors. It's just a product of bureaucracy in government. It's an unacceptable product, but it's the reality of the world. A resilience authority can operate outside of that procurement process, which is really important. Thus, it can result in greater efficiency and speed of project completion. Any debt service incurred by the Resilience Authority does not accrue to the local government's debt ceiling policy. Again, critical piece of why we had to do this, because otherwise it would have limited the number of projects underway at any given time. And we know we do not have that time. It's not on our side when it comes to climate change. As a nonprofit entity, the Resilience Authority is eligible to apply for certain grant funding for which local governments either aren't eligible or not considered competitive enough. This is really important now that we have all the federal infrastructure money on the table. Again, we didn't have a crystal ball. We didn't know a pandemic was happening. We didn't know Joe Biden would be president, but we knew that we wanted to set up entities that were more competitive for federal or other grants outside of local jurisdictions. Resilience authorities can make decisions outside of the political process, so they have greater flexibility to address priority projects and address non-local government projects. So they could work with private entities, they can work in P3s outside of the local jurisdiction. So taking the politics out of deciding priority projects, which as a politician, I can tell you is incredibly important. Resilience authorities have greater flexibility or provide greater flexibility to embrace those innovative solutions that are needed to actually meet the moment. So they can better utilize water quality revolving loan fund from the federal government. They can utilize pay for performance model contracting, which is something we're also working on outside of resilience authorities in Maryland, but that pay for performance is very important in these projects. And they can use that, again, combination. They can patchwork these funds together to actually achieve what they need. And lastly, they're scalable to address larger projects as local governments grow and projects become more and more complex, as we know that they will. So where are we today? Oh, I'm sorry, we passed the bill in the first session. Little detail. One of the advocates came to me and said, how do you know you're going to pass the bill? And I said, well, we've made it broad. We've made it broad enough. We've made it specific enough in what it cannot do. And we also built a coalition of Republicans and Democrats, again, because everybody is going to need this tool, regardless of where your constituents are at. When it comes to the cause of climate change, they're experiencing the effects of climate change. And you're going to want this tool in your toolbox when you need to build these major projects. So pass the bill, all but unanimously in the Senate. I looked it up last night because it was in 2020 we passed the bill. I can't even remember who voted against it, but I'm going to have a talking to with them tomorrow. And all but unanimously in the House. So really exciting. We got it done in that first year. And now comes the hard part, implementation. And that's usually when a legislator can walk away and say, oh, I passed the bill, go have fun with it. It's been a number of years now since we passed the bill, and it was signed into law. And it was, actually, I don't believe it was signed into law because it was 2020 and we had no bill signings because of the pandemic. So there was no fanfare when we passed it. That's okay. The fanfare will come when we actually build these beautiful infrastructure projects. So the place that sparked it all, Annapolis, this is our reimagined city dock that is set to break ground this time next year. It's very exciting. Again, taking what was formerly a parking lot, creating that green space, raising the whole thing by 6 to 8 feet. There's still debate over it, but creating more public water access opportunities, that green infrastructure to cool the whole thing down, incredibly important. Annapolis is an urban center. Not everybody has access to the water. Not everybody has access to a green space. So we want to create that right here at the city dock. So our status at the moment. The good news, our Resilience Authority was formed, which is more complicated than you think when it comes to the fact that the city of Annapolis had to pass a bill, the county, Arundel County, our county had to pass the bill, and they actually had to work together on that, which is not always easy for two jurisdictions to do it. But it's been formed, the board has been appointed, the executive director has been hired. They hired a great person, formerly of our Department of Natural Resources, so has been in this space for a very long time and knows exactly what he's doing. And in the interim, they've identified a portfolio of 17 projects for coastal rehabilitation. So they want to harness nature for risk reduction, and they're working with private landowners, the state, and the county to support the implementation. So we're still in a holding pattern very much in Anne Arundel County. Unfortunately, and I don't think anybody from my district will be watching this today, the way that we're going to fund this project turns out they're not going to utilize the Resilience Authority. We went through all the trouble to pass the bill, and instead, in large part because of the infrastructure bill at the federal level, some other competitive federal grants like BRIC, they believe, my local jurisdiction believes that they can patchwork all the funding together necessary to build this without utilizing the Resilience Authority, which I guess is okay, but the tool is there if they need it. But who beat us to the punch? Shockingly, if anybody here's from Maryland, I know we have a couple, Charles County, which is in southern Maryland. If you go from DC and just keep driving down, you'll get to Charles County. So it's that the peninsula on the left. And you can see again from this NOAA floodplain map, incredibly vulnerable when it comes to sea level rise. So most of it is in blue, which means shore protection is unlikely. It's also, Charles County is growing rapidly. It's one of the fastest growing counties in Maryland because we have a lot of folks who want to leave DC and live in the suburbs. And so we're seeing rapid development that's not always, does not always have an eye towards blue and green infrastructure needed to resist a lot of the flooding challenges that they are now experiencing. The good news is that they beat Anne Arundel to the punch, and they formed the first in the state to form a Resilience Authority. So they're working with our Department of Natural Resources already to do gateway funding, and they are doing a study of the Zakia watershed urban flooding. And their Resilience Authority is now working with DNR to submit the proposal that will turn the climate change challenge into an opportunity to remedy stormwater flooding holistically and incorporating that green infrastructure with the co-benefits of the green infrastructure, the water quality benefits, the flooding mitigation, all in the name of increasing public water access. So that's one of the projects they're working on. They're also utilizing the 5 Million Trees Partnership, I mentioned before that we wanted to have an eye towards equity in the blue and green infrastructure investment Maryland is investing in. So a couple years back, we passed a bill called the Tree Solutions Now Act. We had a large climate change bill that I'll speak about in a minute that was just tanking. It was just not going to pass that year. So we pulled out a piece of it when it came to trees. I had read a Bay Journal article earlier that summer that showed that the Chesapeake Bay Foundation was working with a community in Richmond, an overburdened community in Richmond that had very little tree canopy. And everybody here knows the direct connection between tree canopy, water quality, air quality, temperature reduction, all of those things. So we just harnessed all of that information and put it into a separate bill to save part of the overarching climate bill that year, where we have a goal of planting 5 million trees, and a significant portion of them are dedicated to overburdened communities. And we defined overburdened communities in law for the first time as communities that had been historically redlined, which is a huge problem in Maryland, communities that have a disproportionately high unemployment rate, high poverty rate, high Medicaid rate. And so we actually mapped out overburdened communities in Maryland for the first time, and we're targeting tree plantings in those communities in partnership with local NGOs in those communities. So Charles County is actually utilizing that and thinking through how to plant trees in overburdened communities, again, to help, in this case, green infrastructure, reduce flooding, increase air quality, et cetera. The Charles County Resilience Authority is joining in DNR's application for NOAA's Coastal Zone Management Grant with a project on the first waterfront public access site with a beach in Charles County, which is really exciting. And they're creating a community-based climate resilience hub in Waldorf, which is kind of the center of the county. It's the county seat, through a partnership with New Hope Community Outreach Services. And we just passed a bill this last year. Our new governor's priority bill was to create a service year opportunity for Maryland's young people. So they're partnering with that new Department of Service and Civic Innovation to actually implement a lot of these on-the-ground projects, which is really exciting. That was the goal of the bill, is to get young people back into public service. So Charles County is kicking our butts, and that's fine. It's great for them. They have issues. Okay, so that's Resilience Authority in a nutshell. Again, I will make sure the reports that we've had sent to the General Assembly are sent to this group as well. And stay tuned for Arundel, because we're just getting underway. Okay, I wanted to make sure we had an opportunity to talk about the other tools for climate resilience that we found in Maryland to be incredibly important. So, I mentioned first that it's incredibly important to have these ambitious, lofty, sometimes out of reach policy goals. I'm a very measured person. I represent one of the last purple districts in Maryland. I have a district that is incredibly passionate about the environment. We're surrounded by the Chesapeake Bay, but I have a district that's incredibly tax averse. So I have to kind of always be in the middle. But when it comes to climate issues, I get a little more leeway. At the same time, we can't just plant a flag and say we need to get to 100% renewable energy by 2030 and not have that infrastructure built out. So I want to make sure that I know we have ambitious policy goals, but we need to build out that infrastructure. So when I first got to the General Assembly in 2019, we passed the Clean Energy Jobs Act. The goal here in law is that we achieve 50% renewable energy by 2030 and 100% thereafter. We're on a good click at this point, but again, we have to build that infrastructure out, and I'll talk about that in a moment. The good news about this bill is it brought the labor community and the environmental community together, who sometimes can be very much at odds when it comes to good family sustaining paying jobs, because we said these are the jobs of the future. Fastest growing job industries in Maryland, wind and solar. So we want to make sure we're investing properly. In 2022, we passed an overarching Climate Solutions Now Act. That was the bill that I said tanked in 21, and we were able to pull out the tree portion of the bill. We passed it in 22 after a lot of negotiation. But the goal here is to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 60% by 2031. So super lofty goal. We're going to build the plane as we fly it in Maryland to get to that 60% reduction. And then another important policy goal, and appreciating that land preservation, conservation, those natural green and blue infrastructure pieces are incredibly important when it comes to climate resiliency. We passed the Maryland the Beautiful Act just this last session. That was my bill. President Biden has gone on record as saying he wants
the nation to have a 30 by 30 goal of preserving and conserving 30% of land and waters by 2030. In Maryland, the good news is we're at like 27.8% of our land preserved. So we said, let's keep going. Let's get to 30% by 2030, but let's push ourselves and get to 40% by 2040. Now, how we do that is the next slide. Okay, I mentioned these strategic policy tools. We have the goals, and then once we pass a bill, we can't just walk away. We have to think about how we're actually going to meet these goals. And so these are just a few of the things that we need to do. So I chaired the pensions subcommittee for a number of years, the joke being I'm the youngest senator, the most vested interest in a pension system. So we actually came together and said we have a lot of states who are thinking of divestment of our pension system from climate polluting industries. And then we have other states like Texas saying, well, we can't possibly do that. Let's legislate against that. In Maryland, we found a middle ground. And what we did was simply say that our state retirement and pension system has to consider climate change as a financial factor when making investment decisions. Climate risk equals fiduciary risk. We need to have a balanced and equitable clean energy policy. So we need to think about community solar, ensure that people who live in apartments and not just houses with rooftops can actually access clean and renewable energy. We have to develop incentives for developers for solar development for low and moderate income neighbors, and we have to be innovative in our tax policy. This is one we're working on this next year. The Great Maryland Outdoors Act, a lot of states post-pandemic invested in our state park system, appreciating that a lot of people rediscovered state parks during the pandemic. Maryland put $200 million aside to invest in our state parks, $5 million of which is dedicated to blue and green infrastructure. So using state lands to actually achieve our climate goals. Forest Conservation Act this last year, a critical update to a 30-year-old law that was meant to slow down forest loss. We updated this last year. It was the fight of my life. But it did a number of things, including prioritizing riparian buffers, appreciating that not all forest is created equal. We need to prioritize forest along waterways, prioritize multifamily housing. Density is a good thing for housing affordability and the environment, and it prioritized contiguous forest. Lastly, we passed a Buy Clean bill. A lot of states are doing this now, utilizing our procurement system to say that we need to prioritize clean cement and concrete in state buildings. Lastly, mitigating the effects of climate change. Again, I mentioned the devastation my district has seen in the last few years. This is a picture from our latest tornado. So we need to make sure that we're constantly updating our science in our law. So we've passed a number of bills now requiring immediate and consistent updates to rainfall data that are in our law so that we are not utilizing rainfall data from when I was in grade school, which is what we did. From the 1990s, we were using rainfall data to inform our stormwater and our construction codes. That's no longer working. We're seeing these systems being overwhelmed. So we passed a bill that we have to immediately update that rainfall data and then consistently every 5 years. We've passed a Chief Resilience Officer bill in 2022, with establishing a resilience czar to oversee and coordinate statewide strategy, again, cross-departmental. And lastly, this last year, we put aside funding for a state disaster recovery fund to establish a $10 million fund for the state to assist local governments in the instances of microstorms and disasters. Storms that aren't going to rise to the $10 million FEMA threshold, but we're going to see more and more microstorms because of climate change impact our communities, and we need to have a response at the state level to actually mitigate. And I'm done. I think I made it under 2 minutes.
Yes, Wayne Cobley from GCA, great job. Question, the blue infrastructure you're talking about, is that offshore wind? And then why wouldn't the Resilience Authority want to get in on some of the match money from the Infrastructure Act just to prove they can do bond?
Oh, we absolutely want to get on the infrastructure. My point was we passed this bill before the infrastructure bill existed, and no one thought the federal government, we thought the federal government was just out of the infrastructure game. It turns out the timing is great because we can better utilize that infrastructure funding, and we can have a parallel track of a local government applying for infrastructure funding and a resilience authority doing it too. So we have two bites at that apple. To your first question, blue infrastructure, we're thinking wetlands. We're thinking that natural ability to filter clean water, but also to provide that that really necessary and natural barrier and protection from climate change.
Yep.
Senator, congratulations on getting it passed. Not easy to held all those jurisdictions. So we have a lot of authorities here at Massport, which owns the building over there and the airport and whatnot, MBTA. Can you talk about the role of the private sector in this? Because if we all own the shoreline, we have multiple jurisdictions, hard enough to get it passed. But when you've got potentially potentially eminent domain, or those interests which may not have long-term at their force. A lot of people own land here, and then you want to do something, but you can't because they're invested more short-term.
So I think I heard your question, and one of my table mates was talking to me about Massachusetts having almost all of your shoreline is publicly owned. Is that correct?
There's a lot.
A lot of it. In Maryland, we have very few opportunities for public ownership and public water access. So it's the reverse. It's the total exception. I mean, less than 1 or 2% of our shoreline's actually accessible to the public or publicly owned. So that's one of our challenges that's just different than Massachusetts. But your question was, how do we engage the private sector in this work? That's a great question. Well, they're going to be impacted too. I won't scroll back, but all of those small businesses that are impacted on a almost weekly basis from flooding, they want to be engaged. The folks, unfortunately, there are many small businesses, so they don't have the same ability to help out, but we want to work with them, and that's where the Resilience Authority can come in. They can say, can you put up a little bit of money to help match this so we can leverage that money for whatever federal government grant match that we need. So those are the smaller businesses. On the larger scale side, I mentioned that we're diving into this pay-for-performance contracting and the utilization of P3s more. We also passed a bill, the Conservation Finance Act, 2 years ago, that was meant to leverage that private funding for public outcomes, again, by pay-for-performance and utilizing a lot of trading credits and things like that. We haven't really thought about how to do it from an infrastructure perspective yet, but I will think about it.
Wow. I think I speak for everyone when I say that that's an incredible amount of work. It's really impressive, and it is inspiring and also a reminder of how much we have to do in Massachusetts. Our next speaker is Suzanne Smith. She's the Executive Director of the Sonoma County Regional Climate Protection Authority. Suzanne has been the Executive Director of the Sonoma County Transportation Authority since 1997 and oversaw the creation of the Regional Climate Protection Authority as a sister agency in 2010. She's responsible for securing and coordinating regional, state, and federal funding for projects and programs related to transportation and climate change, managing the Measure M sales tax, and overseeing long-range planning related to transportation, housing, jobs, and climate change. And with that, I'll turn it over to Suzanne.
Thank you to the Environmental Business Council of New England and the Sustainable Solutions Lab at UMass for the invitation to be here today. It's a pleasure to be on the East Coast and talk a little bit about what we're doing in Northern California when it comes to governance structures and climate resilience. I think we've heard it from the senator, and I think it'll probably be a common theme today, that climate change requires much greater collaboration across jurisdictional boundaries. Okay. So Sonoma County is about an hour north of San Francisco and is part of the 9-county Bay Area that stretches from Silicon Valley and Santa Clara through San Francisco up to wine country in the north. And while we are known for our wine and beer and sometimes cannabis, we're also home to about 500,000 people in a large geographic area that includes 75 miles of coastline and bayline. So we're not Anne Arundel County, but we do have quite a bit of coastline to deal with. The board for my agency, the Regional Climate Protection Authority, is made up of local elected officials from each of our 9 cities and members of our county board of supervisors. We were founded by state legislation in 2009 after several years of grassroots activity on the part of a local nonprofit that really laid the groundwork with our local elected officials about the need for local action before climate change was really a huge issue of the day. This was the pre-Al Gore era when our local group was really sort of raising the alarm about the importance of addressing climate change locally. So in 2007, a decision was made to utilize an existing structure, the Sonoma County Transportation Authority, to take on a coordinated local government response to climate change policy and planning, and to hopefully use that structure to bring in funds to advance our climate goals. The Transportation Authority was a natural place to land in that 60% of our greenhouse gas emissions in Sonoma County come from the transportation sector. But more importantly than that, we had the governance structure. All 9 of our cities were representative as well, were represented on the Transportation Authority, as well as the unincorporated county. I also volunteered and our board wanted to lead the effort, so it worked out really great. And so what we knew was that local government didn't have the resources to hire climate staff, but they wanted to start doing the work. So centralizing the planning and policy aspects into a more regional entity was an efficient way to handle things. And the good news is everyone was on board. The less great news was everyone wanted us to do everything. And so the challenge of adequately resourcing the agency as pressures grow to do more has continues till today. Okay. So it did require special legislation to create the Regional Climate Protection Authority. We started to do the work at the Transportation Authority, and the lawyers came in and told me I couldn't do energy efficiency programs because they weren't transportation related. So we ran a bill and became the first regional entity in the state, and we think maybe in the country, tasked with addressing climate change. Once we were up and running, we really became the connective tissue representing local governments at a regional level, so in the Bay Area, but also at the state and federal levels when it came to policy, planning, funding discussions around climate change. We also have built really strong bonds with our other county-wide agencies, whether it's water, our open space district, solid waste, our energy procurement, Sonoma Clean Power, that entity. We work very closely with them to, as they advance their climate goals, we partner together. So through our work, we leverage resources, we strive to reduce duplication of effort, and we coordinate and communicate across staff and our with our policymakers. Our board of directors is, as I said, the same as our Transportation Authority, and so that enables a lot of collaboration and accountability with both a city perspective and an unincorporated county perspective. At the staff level, we really are able to foster those relationships that we've built over the years with the transportation side of things. Switching gears to climate has been a lot easier because we have monthly meetings with planning directors or public works directors. So it's not just the gray infrastructure. We're able to talk about all of the work that covers the utilities or energy or buildings or open space or parks, and have those conversations in those existing committees. There we go. So since 2009, we've been evolving as this planning and policy organization, and it started with a major effort of a 10-jurisdiction climate action plan. That was community-wide climate action plan. That was our first sort of foray into planning. We then did a clean transportation plan focused on fuel shift and mode shift. We were recognized by the Obama administration in 2014 as a climate champion, one of 16 from across the country. And then in 2019, we helped all of our municipalities to adopt a climate emergency resolution that set a tone both in terms of identifying the challenge, but also the need for audacious goals and a roadmap on how to get there. That roadmap became the Sonoma Climate Mobilization Strategy. Okay, so the Sonoma Climate Mobilization Strategy focuses on 3 initiatives. We've got transportation, buildings, land and water. All right, thank you. And within those 3, there's this overarching acknowledgement that environmental justice and deep community engagement are a critical part of all 3 programs. In the strategy, we focus on local government actions. There's a lot to be done at all levels of government. As we heard earlier, there's critical role for the state. There's imperative role at the federal level. So we really are targeting the local government response. So knowing what we need to do and having the resources to do it are two very different things. When the RCPA was created, we had no taxing authority and have relied on local government contributions and grants when we were able to compete well for them. That changed last year when the state legislature passed a bill allowing local governments to create what we call climate resilience districts. The author grandfathered our organization into the bill, and we became the first climate resilience district, or CRD, in the state. So a climate resilience district is similar to an enhanced infrastructure financing district, but with greater financing powers and a more limited purpose. California did away with redevelopment years ago, and EIFDs have been a little bit slow to catch on, but the climate resilience district legislation authorizes local agencies to form a special district to deal with climate adaptation and mitigation. So what happens is a local agency adopts a resolution stating their intent. They establish boundaries, what type of projects they will work on, why there's a need, and the goals that it proposes to achieve. It does require a governing board of local agency officials, as well as members of the public on the board. And there's a public hearing process that you have to go through. So as I said, we were grandfathered in, and so what that provided us is new taxing authorities that we did not have. The taxing authorities range from parcel tax, sales tax, tax increment financing, benefit assessment district, and service charges. We're also able to issue bonds that we did not have authority to do that before, but we do not have eminent domain authority, so that stays with the jurisdictions. Examples of eligible projects that we can carry out as a climate resilience district include wetland restoration, levees, living shorelines, cool buildings, facilities to address extreme heat or cold, fire breaks, prescribed burns, fire hardening, groundwater replenishment, water storage, as well as mitigation efforts. So we've taken this new authority and are now in the process of developing a local revenue measure. We're calling it the Climate Protection Initiative, and we hope to put it before voters in November of 2024. In California, we require a 2/3 vote for any tax measure. So it's a pretty high bar to achieve. We have had success with that in our county in the past, but it's not easy. And it means you need to build a very broad coalition. So to do that sort of groundwork, we established a community-based steering committee, 3 program committees, and have held multiple public meetings to discuss priorities and concerns. We paid special attention to addressing equity and have contracted with a number of local organizations to ensure that we're not just hearing from the usual suspects, but we are actually getting out into the community in a much more broadly based way than we have in the past. So we've got some content that we've now developed for the expenditure plan. The next step is we will be conducting some polling in June, it's now June. And we will, once we have those results, we'll suss out what our next steps will be and further develop the content of the expenditure plan. The measure will focus on those 3 areas of our mobilization strategy, though: transportation, buildings, and land and water. And we anticipate the money will be directed to the cities and the county and our partners to implement the bulk of the work. That's the model we've used on the transportation side. So as opposed to creating a large climate organization and staffing it up, the idea is to push that money down to the jurisdictions and build their capacity. So in addition to the RCPA work that we do with cities and counties, I wanted to highlight 3 other examples of government action related to resilience and the structures we've developed to address them. The first is a very, very traditional highway project, except we're making it very untraditional in that it is going to be a resilience project. So State Route 37 connects two highways, Interstate 80 and Highway 101. It crosses 4 counties. It's the north end of the San Francisco Bay, and it is at risk from sea level rise. It also has a significant congestion problem and no transit. So what we've done is create what we call a joint policy committee. All 4 counties, we have elected officials from the 4 counties in partnership with Caltrans, which is our state Department of Transportation, and our Metropolitan Planning Organization, MTC. They have created this group that meets quarterly. We also have team meetings on a more regular basis that is targeted or focused on addressing the problems of congestion, resilience, public access, transit, and developing the projects that need to go forward. So that organization is working on the environmental documents. They're prioritizing projects. They're applying for grants. It's a pretty unique project in that it is multi-jurisdictional across counties, but also involves the state and the region. The next example is less formal, but it arose out of a need for an urgent response following the 2017 wildfires in Sonoma County. So within a week of the fire in October of 2017, which destroyed over 5,000 homes, we called an emergency meeting of the planning directors. They typically meet monthly, but we started meeting weekly to address permitting and policy changes that were needed in the wake of the disaster. It was everything from RV parking policies in cities that weren't affected by the fires to how to deal with accessory dwelling units as part of the rebuild and changing policies across, so that it was uniform across jurisdictions for that, working with utilities. So all of this was happening in the wake of this disaster, but it became a forum for good communication and sort of consistency in terms of response. And we carried that over to our board as well. So we agendized monthly items about disaster recovery, and it gave the local elected officials an opportunity to check in with each other across jurisdictions about the key issues. Coming out of that was a recognition that prior to the fires, prior to losing 5,000 units, we had a housing crisis. So we not only needed to rebuild, and we needed to not be distracted, it's kind of a downplaying how awful it was, but we needed to also be able to build new homes as well. So that resulted in the RCPA facilitating a discussion between the County of Sonoma and the City of Santa Rosa, which is our largest jurisdiction. 2 separate organizations emerged from that. The Renewal Enterprise District, or the RED, which is a joint powers authority between the county and the City of Santa Rosa, and the RED Housing Fund, which is a nonprofit revolving loan fund. Both entities serve to align our local efforts to accelerate production of infill and mid to high density housing that's near transit, jobs, amenities, et cetera. The RED to date has been able to blend financing and public funds to launch affordable and middle income units, leverage state and federal grants, as well as create housing that realizes policy goals for increased density, access to transit, improved energy efficiency, climate resilience, and affordability. Those were all the tenets of the Renewal Enterprise District. So since 2018, 5 projects are under construction. A 6th has broken ground. There will be just about 600 new units as a result of the efforts from the Renewal Enterprise District, including, or because of about $120 million in funds that they were able to help bring to the county. So I guess I would leave with the message that the key is to be nimble. We've, I think, all in this room embraced the fact that we need to address climate change and address adapting to it. Being nimble and creative, trying new things to see if they work, ensuring good communication, which is challenging across jurisdictions, but really working on that, and recognizing that those traditional boundaries often don't fit with climate resilience projects, so we need to be flexible. So thank you for the opportunity today, and I look forward to the rest of the panel and the rest of the day.
Thanks, Suzanne. Our next speaker is Mark Rupp, Adaptation Program Director at Georgetown Climate Center, where he's responsible for leading a team in support of resilience, equity, and community-based solutions at the local, state, and federal levels. He also serves as an adjunct professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center, teaching courses in environmental law and climate change. Prior to joining Georgetown Climate Center, Mark worked at the Environmental Defense Fund and held several positions in state and federal government. I'll turn it over to Mark.
Hi, it's great to see everybody. And Deanna, thanks for the introduction. This forum comes at a very perfect time because we at the Georgetown Climate Center just released a report last week with a partner organization, the Headwaters Economics out of Montana, on how to decrease flood risk with regional collaborations. And I would commend to you the report as well as on our website. We did tape a webinar when we released the report. So you can actually see two of our case study partners go a lot more in depth into the work that they were doing. Just quickly, for those who aren't familiar with the Georgetown Climate Center, we were created in 2009 to serve as a resource to states, working at the nexus of state and federal and local governments. We're a very small team, about a dozen of us. The majority of the staff work on mitigation, largely from transportation and the power sector, and then my small little team works on adaptation. We do a lot of policy development. We convene folks from different levels of government and other experts around particular issues. Because we are at the Law Center, we work with students quite a bit. We had a research assistant working with us on the report that we released last week. And one of the things that my adaptation program does is maintain an adaptation clearinghouse. For those of you who have not been here, it's an enormous searchable database where you can find state, local, federal plans with the intention that communities who might want to start off with the climate action plan, adaptation plans, might get a sense as to how other communities have approached that. We include things like resilience authorities, so we've got that, and the ordinances passed by Charles and Arundel and Annapolis. Before I get to this, one other tool, just because it came up at my table, we've also created a managed retreat toolkit that a lot of communities have found helpful, as well as an equitable adaptation toolkit. I wanted to show this slide because everyone's familiar with the report that came out, sixth assessment report came out last year. Working Group 2's submission around adaptation and vulnerability. These are the three sort of pieces that really sort of came out to me in reading this report. Transformational adaptation, the fact that we have been doing piecemeal adaptation for so long, and to actually achieve what we need to achieve at this moment in time, we need to get transformational. Equity and justice is at the heart, looking to indigenous knowledge, where we can incorporate that. And then finally, and why I'm so grateful to Deanna and Kathleen for focusing this whole session on governance, is the fact that the IPCC report highlighted the importance of governance, and not just governance across levels of government, but climate change as it's affecting every aspect of society really demands that we bring in all of society into the conversation. And so the private sector, nonprofits, academia, and so the group represented in this room and online truly is that sort of governance structure that we need to be thinking about more holistically. I'm going to unfortunately give really short shrift to what was an incredible amount of work by my colleagues at the Climate Center and Headwaters Institute in really diving into 5 different case studies and engaging with people who were involved in all of these issues. The impetus for this came from the Headwaters economics folks who do a lot of work around flooding. And we wanted to explore sort of the multi-jurisdictional efforts that can bring about positive change in addressing flooding challenges in the Midwest specifically. So These are the 5 jurisdictional areas that we're looking at. I'm just going to provide sort of a high-level view of what was going on in each jurisdiction, but again, would commend you to the report that goes a lot farther in depth. So in Dubuque County, for those not familiar, this is eastern Iowa, adjacent to the Mississippi River. A lot of rural ag lands, as you can imagine, but there are some denser areas like the city of Dubuque. Tremendous flooding in 2008 in this area. And the state legislature came around in 2010 to authorize watershed management authorities in an effort to encourage collaboration among multiple levels of government. One of the first authorities to be created was the Catfish Creek Watershed Management Authority, which is within the Dubuque County watershed, bringing in board members from a number of local jurisdictions, as well as the Dubuque Soil and Water Conservation District. Bringing in, and this is probably demonstrated in each of our case studies, but in an effort to demonstrate this close collaboration really does help to attract federal funding. And that was the case here through the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Natural Resources Conservation Service, as well as FEMA. Folks may be familiar with HUD's Natural Disaster Resilience Competition from several years ago. Iowa's share of that was $97 million, and they created the Iowa Watershed Approach, headquartered at the Iowa Flood Center. So in bringing together multiple partners within Dubuque, was able to pull down a lot of those resources from that funding. One of the things that's been really important is farmer engagement. And it's one thing to be government trying to engage with community members, but having community members leading the conversations. And so the farmers themselves demonstrating to their colleague farmers the opportunities that exist through the federal funding really proved positive to reduce nutrient pollution, to sequester carbon, and actually build flood resilience. Atchison County, Missouri, this is in the northwest corner of Missouri. For 50, 60 years, this region has had considerable flood challenges with at least one levee breaching each year. Then fast forward 2019, in Atchison County, their levee was breached more than 100 times due to flooding issues. And so the community members, governments really wanted to think about how to explore setting the levee back in order to give the river places to go. There were a number of partners, state, federal, there was a regional council. One of the things with so many partners involved in this particular case study was having a trusted third-party convener. To Suzanne's point about communication is incredibly difficult. So bringing in the Nature Conservancy to facilitate those conversations. They would convene meetings on a weekly basis and really make sure that each participant to the collaboration was really engaging with one another. One of the things that came out of this, and oftentimes we look at disasters as being the compelling force to actually take action, and so this flooding obviously triggered that. But it really compelled even federal agencies to work a little bit more collaboratively than they may otherwise have, and particularly folks with history with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which is responsible for building the levees. They actually engaged in an MOU with USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service around purchasing of easements. Oftentimes, for NRCS to identify titles to buy easements is an incredibly long, laborious process. But in an MOU that the two federal agencies came in on, the Army Corps of Engineers actually was ceding more time to NRCS to go and identify those titles and did not stop them from beginning construction. Dodge County, Nebraska. This is a rural area in eastern Nebraska that's got a population of a little over 37,000 people. Lots of farmland, but also a number of townships, villages, 4 cities to include the city of Fremont, which is the county seat of Dodge County. The Platte River runs along the southern border of Dodge County, and the Elkhorn River and Rawhide Creek rivers are also nearby and contribute to a lot of the flooding challenges that are experienced. A lot of vulnerabilities. There's a single hospital in the county. There's the Fremont Airport, and there are a number of assisted living facilities and senior centers. So in March of 2019, keep coming back to 2019 in the Midwest, folks will remember all the flooding that was happening there. Flooding damaged over 1,500 homes and buildings, overtopped roads, and actually members of the community were isolated for 4 days. So then just a month later, in April, folks came together to figure out how to coordinate and take steps to mitigate their flood risk. And out of that, all of these townships, the villages, state and federal partners came together for the Dodge County Joint Water Management Advisory Board. One of the things that came out of creating this board was the fact that no one had ever communicated with the diking and drainage districts in the area, which actually have a lot of authority over dikes and ditches. And they weren't even included in the county hazard mitigation plan. So suddenly governments at all levels are realizing that for a long time we've excluded a really vital part to the whole mosaic. And so they were brought in. As the partnership grew, there were a lot of concerns about funding because you had larger jurisdictions, very small jurisdictions. These diking and drainage districts rely on volunteer farmers, essentially, with very little budget. And so as they started to think about the various projects that were going to be needed to address the flooding, what would each jurisdiction's contribution be? And they didn't want it to be equal across the board, understanding that some jurisdictions could contribute more than others. And so that's the way that they approached it and didn't require equal contributions across the board. So with the advisory board, there was also a long-term recovery group that was created. Two different, but working in parallel together. The advisory group was working on sort of how to alleviate risks. And the recovery group was trying to figure out how to help the communities that were devastated by the 2019 floods. And one example of that is there is a mobile home park where there are a lot of immigrants and Latinos who worked in the fields, really an integral part to the fabric of the community. They were unable to access FEMA disaster dollars due to FEMA processes, language barriers, whatever it was. But the recovery group was able to tap into private resources and contributions and actually support the rehabilitation of the mobile park. So they, again, communication and really striving to stay in touch with one another. Advisory board members participate in recovery group meetings, vice versa. And then there are oftentimes interchanges in order to cross-pollinate what's going on at each of their meetings. Central Arkansas Water. This is a publicly owned utility that serves greater Little Rock as well as North Little Rock, serves about 500,000 people. The Board of Commissioners, 4 are nominated by Little Rock City Council, 3 by North Little Rock, and serve at 7-year terms. They own and operate 2 primary service water reservoirs, Lake Maumelle and Lake Winona. One of the things, and getting short on time, one of the things that's unique is that a utility actually goes out and buys parcels of land, but that's what this utility does. They worked with the World Resources Institute 15 years ago to develop a rate surcharge that they continue to keep their members, the residents aware of. But then one of the unique things about Little Rock and the Central Water was that they created the nation's first green bond for water quality projects. And so they've been able to use the surcharge to pay onto the bond, and they are buying up parcels within those 2 watersheds. Just quickly, Marengo, there's actually, we appropriately honored those who came before us at the top of this meeting. One of the partners in this particular project was the Mashkazibi tribe. But again, just multiple jurisdictions coming together. And one of the things that they've been able to do is create an action plan that was just updated this year. If you see the report and the recommendations, existing regional groups are really critical. And I think Suzanne made this point well, that her effort has grown out of the transportation sector, but being able to tap into existing governance structures really helps to bring in the partners. They've got funding mechanisms that can all be well served. And so that's the key point of that slide. And for state and federal government, do exactly what the senator articulated earlier. Design methodologies and legal structures so that you can have regional collaborations. I do want to say one thing in closing, that in terms of governance structure, because we've talked about the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, and governance structures in terms of getting those resources out are also critically important. And states are sort of all over the map in terms of how they've organized themselves. Some I think have done a really good job. Others I think are a little more short-sighted. But the federal government is having a very difficult time organizing itself. So I think it really does fall to state governments to work across every single agency and help communities access the resources. Because while the Biden administration talks about $50 billion for resilience in the infrastructure law, I look at the entirety of the 1.2 trillion for infrastructure money as the opportunity to actually build resilience in our country. And so if the federal government's not thinking in that way, then state governments need to be thinking about it in that way, as well as local governments. The Inflation Reduction Act, for as much as people think about the tax incentives to drive new technological innovations, there's also just a ton of cash in that. $220 billion for NRCS. So NRCS weighed heavily in a lot of these particular partnerships, just giving cash to farmers to do conservation plans. $1 billion for HUD. So governance in terms of how all those resources play out is really critical as well. So appreciate the opportunity to talk about governance. Encourage you to look at this report, and thank you very much for your time.
So welcome back, everyone. I'm Kathleen Brill. I'm co-chairing the forum today along with Deanna Moran. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to the speakers from the first half of our presentation, Senator Elfreth, Suzanne Smith, and Mark Rupp, for these fascinating presentations highlighting the work underway in Maryland, California, and the Midwest. Now we're going to turn a bit closer to home with some presentations focused on recent and emerging efforts in New England, including Connecticut and Boston. So first we're going to hear from Louanne Cooley, who's a legal research fellow with the Connecticut Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation, an organization whose mission is to increase the resilience and sustainability of communities vulnerable to the growing impacts of climate change on the natural, built, and human environments. The organization is a collaboration between the University of Connecticut and the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. Louanne is going to talk to us about the challenges faced by Connecticut communities and recent legislation passed in Connecticut enabling municipalities to create stormwater authorities empowered to assess fees and fund resiliency infrastructure. Louanne has a JD from UConn Law, a BS and MS in biology from Bowling Green State University, and is an elected official serving on the Planning and Zoning Commission in the town of Mansfield. Welcome, Louanne.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the introduction, and I'm really happy to be here. This is such a wonderful opportunity for all of us, to hear all of these different perspectives about how local governments, state governments, regional governments are working together on these complicated issues. I was asked to talk about government structures in Connecticut that foster climate resilience, and I'm going to tell you a bit about the legislation that's been developed and the communication between state agencies and the work of nonprofits in guiding decision-making. But I want to start a little bit with a thought experiment. Connecticut's a small town. It's a small state, really, with feels like a small town, though. We have no county level government, And coming from Ohio, I find that where we have counties and we have townships, I find that just bizarre, but that's the way we have it there. We have 169 little towns and big cities, all of which are completely different jurisdictions, and they don't necessarily want to talk or work with one another, okay? So regionalism is not something that is a big player in Connecticut, but as we know, when you're dealing with issues with climate change, it becomes extraordinarily important. So we're a mix of these coastal cities, several large urban cities, small towns, and lots of rural towns. And with this diversity in mind, if you're a municipal official or a staffer, what are your concerns with relation to climate change? Who's calling you up to complain about something or worried about something? What do you have to think about? You kind of think about these things. These are the first sorts of things that hit. And then after these first initiative and immediate issues, you start thinking about the processes that are disrupted by these kinds of events, right? Transportation and housing, infrastructure, financial issues that come up because of things like excessive heat or environmental degradation, flooding. And then finally, you start to think about the tools that you have to address the causes or the events of these disrupted processes. And of course, to some extent, the immediate issues will take precedent, like how smoke plumes this week from fires in Nova Scotia are impacting us right here today in New England and in the Boston area, in fact. And what does that smoke plume do? Leads to air quality issues, the likes of which we don't normally see here. So we're seeing the kinds of air quality issues in New England and along the East Coast that the Pacific Northwest and California exactly has to deal with these large, gigantic scale fires. The fires in Nova Scotia, big, disruptive, devastating, but tiny compared to what California and other areas in the West are seeing. So if you're a local official and somebody's calling you up and saying, hey, my child had to go to the emergency room today because of air quality issues and their asthma is flaring up, what are you going to do about it? That town official is adding that to their list of all the things that they have to think about. Okay, so if we're thinking about this from the state level, how does the state prioritize those kinds of problems? Now, how do they think about how to find solutions? How do they fund those solutions? And what tools are available to help towns put those plans and solutions into action? Okay, so how does Connecticut prioritize these issues, right? And related to that, a really important part of that is who has a seat at the table, right? Because really, that's the key question, isn't it? The questions get answered by who has input. So one thing that other speakers have said today, and I think we really need to think about and we need to push our government to do, is to really remember that any kind of action has to be approached in a way that's just, that's equitable, and I think interdisciplinary. Instead of having siloed information, we need to have people with all different kinds of expertise and experiences talking together. All right, so here in Connecticut, the tools the state has to prioritize climate action, I want to briefly mention some of the executive orders, the legislation, and the agency policy that have played a role in our climate adaptation and resilience efforts over the last few years. And I'm focusing really on climate resilience and not mitigation today, but that also has been happening and happening in parallel, but it's a totally big conversation to have in 15 minutes. Back to the tools that the state has to prioritize climate action. In 2015, under Governor Dan Malloy, Executive Order 1550 created a mechanism for state agencies to communicate about climate issues and to work in concert about solutions. And I can't stress how incredibly important this is. Get everybody at the table. Get the transportation people and the housing people, the emergency managers, all of these big state agencies, the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, give them a forum, give them a mechanism and an ability to talk about things in parallel and make sure that everybody understands what other agencies are doing. This has consisted of monthly meetings. They've worked on policy issues together. Currently, this group has kind of tapered off a little bit, but this is something I think should be revised and reinvigorated. It'd be really great to see this kind of communication continuing at the state level. And then there are two, oops, let me go back. There are two executive orders under Governor Lamont that have been very important drivers of climate policy. In 2019, he revived and recharged the Governor's Council on Climate Change we call it the GC3. And that's an advisory board that works on climate mitigation and adaptation, has 23 members from state agencies, quasi-public agencies, businesses, local governments, nonprofits, and there are 6 working groups that have roughly another 100 or so people involved in them. So a lot of people coming together, seat at the table, talking about the issues that their perspective, their expertise, their communities are involved in. The GC3's Phase 1 report was issued in early 2021, and it included policy recommendations, some of which were ultimately advanced to the legislature. And I list here some of the public acts that have been adopted in recent years, including several that came from the 2021 session. That GC3 report came out in January of 2021 at the very beginning of the legislative session. And it resulted in a couple of pieces of legislation. The most important one that I've highlighted there, I'm going to talk about more, was it was an act concerning climate adaptation. And this was the act that allowed the creation of municipal stormwater authorities, which is a newish thing for Connecticut, although we know there are thousands of them across the state, the country. And it also expanded the authority of flood prevention, climate resilience, and erosion control boards. And one important thing that it did was allow those boards to act across jurisdictions. If 2 adjoining towns, for example, had a flooding issue, they could have a joint flood board. Had to be authorized by both of the town legislatures, but it's a mechanism for fostering that communication across those jurisdictional boundaries. And you'll notice I also included Public Act 2225 from last year's legislative session. While this was largely aimed at climate mitigation in the transportation sector, it did expand the incentive program for electric vehicles to include rebates for e-bikes. And Connecticut's program for e-bike rebates goes live this month. I'm a strong advocate for biking. I think that it's one of those really great multi-solve kinds of issues because it's not just something that's going to reduce vehicle miles traveled, but it can also provide a low-cost, climate-friendly transportation option to vulnerable communities, and that helps them to become more resilient on several different metrics. And then there are also a few ways agencies are incorporating climate resilience policy through granting, hiring dedicated staff, and including resilience into energy regulatory authority. So I'm an ecologist by background. I became a lawyer later on when I realized nobody was listening to the scientists. I love to think about connections, and I like to think about the process of ideas becoming actions. So to map this out, here's just one pathway in Connecticut where you can trace how an executive order in 2019 led to a reinvigoration of the GC3 with many voices at the table. And this led to legislation and further executive orders, which led to a partnership with the UConn's Connecticut Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation. And some of the work that we have done in creating explanatory webinars, engaging communities with workshops, fact sheets geared towards municipal officials, so they can implement some of the climate resilience policies that are authorized by new state statutes, as well as providing grants to help with planning and project development. I asked the question at the beginning, how does the state prioritize projects? Well, one way that they've done that is to expand municipal level legal authority and provide resources for towns to determine what their needs are. With 169 towns, all with different kinds of needs, the state has tried to provide flexibility. And then the second question, this is the big one, everybody has mentioned this, how do you pay for it? And luckily, the federal government, after years and years of really not doing a whole lot, is now providing options for funding for climate adaptation, for energy resilience, for all those kinds of things, if you're prepared to put in project grants, right? So luckily, the work that has been done so far in Connecticut, providing municipalities with access to money for project planning, the work of my organization, CIRCA, in helping prepare those communities to figure out and prioritize what their climate vulnerabilities are, has put a lot of towns in a good position to be able to apply for some of that federal money and put it to good use. That's what we're hoping. So at the state level, two public acts I want to mention that have addressed longer-term climate resilience funding. The first was Public Act 1977, which allows municipalities to create municipal climate change and coastal resilience reserve funds. Like the senator had mentioned earlier, this is a mechanism that towns can sock away those general funds into a dedicated enterprise fund that can be used specifically for climate resilience projects. It can match grants, it can do small projects, et cetera. And CIRCA has done a nice case study of our first town to implement this, Brantford, which started a coastal resilience reserve fund several years ago and has been able to consistently put funding into that so that they are able to use that money for matching grants or whatever their needs may be. And then also, I already mentioned Public Act 21-115, which allowed for the creation of stormwater authorities. And stormwater authorities are important because while they don't have taxing authority, they can charge a utility fee for service. The idea being that your stormwater infrastructure is really similar to your sanitary sewers, which no one has a problem paying for. And the one nice thing about it is that everybody pays. So there is no carve out for nonprofits along the board. Everyone has to contribute to this that generates stormwater. We've had a few towns that have successfully already implemented stormwater authorities, and we at CIRCA have done a little bit of seed grant money to help the towns come up with plans for implementation. All right. Okay, and I didn't mention the Green Bank, but please look that up. It's pretty remarkable thing that we have in Connecticut. So where can towns get help? State agencies, councils of government, the Green Bank, non-governmental, community-based organizations, and university resources like CIRCA, and UConn also has a Center for Land Use Education and Research, which provides a lot of expertise as well. CIRCA, again, is a multidisciplinary agency, combines policy, it combines science, tools, policy, and communication to reach towns and offer them information. One of the big projects that we've worked on at CIRCA, it resulted from a large federal BRIC grant following Hurricane Sandy in 2012. Please go to the CIRCA website, look at all the amazing work in the Resilient Connecticut project, where we've worked with those state agencies and other stakeholders, helped towns originally in New Haven and Fairfield counties, but now our mandate has been expanded to include the rest of the state, to develop frameworks for prioritizing their projects based on vulnerabilities, both social vulnerabilities and physical vulnerabilities in the towns as well. One project that I worked on was a project with the town of Norwalk, which approached us because they had excessive heat issues. So the scientists at CIRCA put out heat data to get a really fine scale map of where those heat problems are. We did a legal authority analysis to look at the different kinds of legal authorities that already exist, things like building codes, zoning codes, plans of conservation and development, design standards, and then issued some policy recommendations about how they can use zoning authority to regulate where you're going to put cooling centers based on their need, and how to enact design standards, including regulating vegetation, shading, reflective materials, and building codes. And then we have done several webinars and have news articles, panel discussions with the officials at Norwalk and also throughout the state to make sure people get the information out there. We're currently working on building a resilient zoning toolkit. One thought was use the zoning authority that's already there. Zoning is a forward-thinking tool. You can't solve a problem today with zoning, but you can at least impact what your vulnerability is going to be in the future. And so that toolkit hopefully will be released within the next month and gives a lot of policy recommendations for towns that they can use the authority they already have to enact design standards, things like that, to try to address some of these issues of climate. And then just really quickly, I really would encourage everybody again to go to the CIRCA Resilient Connecticut website, where you'll find lots of fact sheets and white papers that we have produced on various state authorities. We've got a brand new product that's going to be released this week, which is so exciting. It's a policy resource guide. It's about 40 pages of information about how municipalities can use the incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act to think about energy resilience from a community and local level. And while we're gearing this towards Connecticut, I think there's information in there that could be useful to any town, anywhere. The idea with this is to try to put this out now and then revise it as policy changes so that this will be a living document for people to be able to access. Next week, for example, CIRCA is having a webinar. Everyone is welcome. That's going to be talking specifically about energy resilience. This is a new initiative that my colleague Kurt Mayland has been pushing for the last few months. So that should be really exciting to talk about this collaboration between people who work in the energy field and people who work in the policy field to try to help municipalities think about energy resilience, which isn't something that many have done so far. We're also working on developing resilience training for land use officials. As a land use official myself, I recognize that many people who find themselves in that role come from very diverse backgrounds and perspectives and may not recognize the power that they have to actually use zoning as a tool for climate resilience. And I just wanted to thank you again, and it's been a real pleasure to be here and to listen to the other speakers. I find it really encouraging to hear the work that's being done at both the state and local level. So thank you.
Thank you, Louanne. Next, we're going to hear from Boston's very own Devin Quirk, Deputy Chief for Development and Transformation with the Boston Planning and Development Agency. Devin's been with the City of Boston for 13 years, including time spent as the Director of Operations for the Department of Neighborhood Development and Director of Real Estate for the BPDA. In Devin's present role, he has oversight over daily operations for the BPDA, an agency which is undergoing a significant transformation under the new leadership of Mayor Wu and Chief Arthur Jemison. Devin is going to speak to us today about the city's plans to utilize the BPDA's existing urban renewal tools to address today's challenges of resilience, affordability, and equity, and the legislation that would provide them with this authority. Welcome, Devin.
Great, thanks you for that introduction, Kathleen. So I'm here to talk to you a little bit how we're bringing a blast from Boston's past, specifically our checkered history and our renewal, and sort of pushing it forward to think about a lot of the tools and principles that were talked about today from other states and localities. I think I see a lot of overlap here. I certainly have. But before I get into that, I wanted to start with a question. Who here took a boat to get here to the conference today? Anyone in the room? That a room full of resilience folks and no one took a boat? That's, okay, we got at least one. I live in Charlestown, just across the harbor. I was going to take a boat so I could say that I did, but the timing didn't work out, so I just took the Silver Line instead. But we have a great ferry service here in Boston. I wanted to plug it, but that's not why I'm asking. I'm asking because of this map right here, which shows the flood risk for downtown Boston and our surrounding neighborhoods. And if we don't act, I think you can see very clearly the seaport is the darkest blue. Most flood risk. We'll all be taking boats to come to work if we don't act. So up to 18% of Boston's land area will be exposed to a flood by 2070, and for a 1% storm, a Hurricane Sandy-like event. So the need for action is clearly now. And I probably don't need to tell this room this, but the threat of flooding in Boston is an existential threat to our community and our region's economy. Boston is actually the 8th most vulnerable city in the world to financial loss from sea level rise, and the 4th in the US. By 2030, 18,000 residents in Boston and over $20 billion worth of buildings will be threatened by sea level rise. By 2070, this expands to 85,000 residents and over $85 billion worth of real estate. And sea level rise is by far not our only climate vulnerability. We've talked a lot about that today, but there are other challenges facing Boston. By many measures, extreme heat is actually a more dangerous phenomenon in Boston. This slide shows that our summers are getting hotter and the number of hot days in Boston are growing. And because of these trends, the heat mortality rate in Boston is expected to more than triple by 2070. And if you overlay that with a map of our city, you'll see that this clearly overlaps with environmental justice communities in Boston. So the impacts of heat are not only a serious danger to some of our most vulnerable residents, they're also a really critical social equity challenge. And I know this room knows that the action is needed now, but in case you thought that climate change was some very far away thing, here's our mayor, Mayor Wu, standing in Morrissey Boulevard on a bright blue sky day, and our transportation network is already flooded. We've seen a lot of these pictures from across the country today, and I think they make clear that the impacts are now, so the need for action is now. And while the topic of today's conference is resilience, I would be remiss if I didn't mention some of the other pressing issues that are facing Boston, including the affordability of housing in our city and the deep racial inequities in wealth and participation in our economy. These are all illustrated on the slide, but Boston is an extremely unaffordable place to find housing. Our rents have more than quadrupled in the last 2 decades, which is a much higher rate of growth than other surrounding communities. This issue is also exacerbated by the extreme wealth disparity between white and non-white households. Here in Boston, we have the 6th highest rate of income inequality nationally. So Mayor Wu has asked us to keep, as we're thinking about the future of the BPDA, to keep these challenges at the center of our work. But to tell you where we're going, I want to rewind the clock back to 1950 and the urban renewal movement, and policymakers at that time were really focused on disinvestment in central cities, flight to the suburbs with the invention of the automobile, and they championed ideas that government should be taking aggressive action through eminent domain powers to catalyze investment in cities. And in Boston, as well as other cities across the entire country, this resulted in the unjust displacement of thousands of people from their homes and businesses. On the screen here is an image of the demolition of the West End of Boston, where an entire neighborhood was demolished by city government with thousands of residents displaced and businesses lost. And my agency, the Boston Redevelopment Authority, was at the center of many of these changes and these renewal activities. And while we've changed our name to the Boston Planning and Development Agency, we're still the urban renewal agency for the city of Boston, and our past still haunts us. Because of these socially unjust actions from over a half century ago, our agency is generally distrusted in a lot of Boston's communities. But right now, all of our urban renewal plan areas are expiring in 2025, which gives us the opportunity to rethink whether urban renewal is an area that should be continued in Boston. So before we just say, no, it shouldn't be, there are 2 really big challenges with just ending urban renewal by allowing it to expire. The first is, despite its challenges, urban renewal actually did produce some really important social goods for Boston in the form of community spaces, municipal facilities, and affordable housing. This map here might be a little hard to see, but this shows every parcel in Boston that was touched by urban renewal. There are 832 of them. They stretch from Roxbury through downtown to Charlestown. And many of these parcels have use restrictions on them that protect things like affordable housing or community use restriction. And if we allowed urban renewal to expire in Boston, the ability to enforce these use restrictions would immediately be lost with the expiration of those plan areas. The second issue, which is a little bit more tied to the topic of today, is that our urban renewal legislation gives the BPDA some legal tools to operate as a quasi-governmental organization and a real estate developer for public good. We can do things like act quickly to acquire property for non-municipal purpose. We can negotiate a lease arrangement, and there might be a need to do these things in the future. So, Mayor Wu's asked us to recharter the BPDA with a new focus on Boston's future. And in 1957, the BRA the Boston Redevelopment Authority, was created to address what were seen as the most pressing issues of that time, which were blight, decadence, whatever decadence means, and substandard housing. To this day, any real estate action that we take, the BPDA needs to tie our actions back to those principles. But blight is not the core problem facing Boston today. In 2023, our core challenges are resilience and the need to respond to the threat of climate change, affordability, both the affordability of housing but also the affordability of starting and sustaining small businesses in Boston, and equity, making sure that as we grow our city, we grow more equitably than we have in the past. So Mayor Wu's asked us to recharter the agency to make our central focus not blight, but instead the needs of resilience, affordability, and equity. So to pivot to our agency's future, we filed an act called an Act to Improve and Modernize Community Planning and Development in Boston. That act passed the City Council. We have a home rule state, so things have to go to change state law. You have to go to the city council first. It passes city council with overwhelming majority. It's up at the state house now, and that act does a couple things. First, it officially sunsets the urban renewal era of Boston. It prohibits the agency from taking any further actions related to blight, decadence, or substandard housing. And in doing so, really closes out the 70-year history of urban renewal in Boston, allowing us to look to the future and think about what we need for the next 70 years. It also extends the BPDA's ability to enforce those community use restrictions I talked about, despite the planned areas expiring. So if the act passes, we don't need to worry about that 2025 expiration date. And perhaps most importantly, the act also sets a new set of definitions by which the BPDA can take real estate actions. These include resilience, including the resilience reasons to mitigate and address problems caused by climate change, affordability reasons, including both affordable housing and the affordability of starting and sustaining small businesses, and community development reasons, which is defined broadly in the statute. It's also defined in other areas in state law, but it focuses on expanding access to economic opportunity. So the Act also outlines a set of powerful community development tools that the BPDA can use in service of our new mission for resilience, affordability, and community development. This includes an exemption to Massachusetts state law, Chapter 30B, which is the procurement law in Massachusetts for real estate. Similar to Maryland, we have a lot of procurement challenges when it comes to community development. 30B is a great law when it comes to selling municipal real estate to make sure it's done transparently, but it stands in the way of a lot of community development actions. First and foremost, it requires that all real estate transactions, including acquisitions, be done through RFP. But that makes it really difficult for the city to acquire land. That if you're a seller of land, you don't want to fill out a form to help government buy it. You just want to sell it to the highest bidder. So this means that most people do not work with government buyers. They work with the private real estate market. Secondly, in Boston, we're limited to purchasing land for municipal purpose. And fire stations, schools, open space are municipal purposes, affordable housing, community economic development catalyst, those are not municipal purpose. So an exemption to this law means the BPDA could act like a pro-social real estate, private real estate development entity for social good. And as a quasi-governmental agency, the BPDA is not bound to the municipal use restriction either. So this means, this means that we'd be empowered to negotiate directly with owners for acquisitions for resilience purposes. This could be an easement for a seawall right of way, all the way up to purchasing land for social housing. It would also allow and empower the BPDA to negotiate property leases, such as below market leases for legacy businesses or small business incubator space, something we've heard very clearly in our planning efforts across the community that they want Boston city government to move closely involved in. That was a major theme of the plan we just wrapped up in Mattapan. In addition, the Act also replaces the agency's ability to do discretionary property tax agreements. Again, this is a power we actually have today, but it can only be used when tied to blight. In the future, we could deploy tax assistance for projects aligned with our new mission. And this might mean favorable tax assistance to help finance a resiliency measure, because we know those are very expensive. We could also use this power to do tax deals for affordable housing or arts and cultural space or other community-focused uses. And then finally, the Act also repurposes some of the BPDA's lesser-known but still impactful tools of urban renewal. It gives the BPDA the ability to clear title issues, invest its own resources in development projects, and to issue bonds. But again, only if those actions are tied to the new mission of resilience, affordability, and community development. So finally, I want to just touch on governance at the BPDA and through these changes. Today, the Boston Planning and Development Agency is actually made up of two corporations, the Boston Redevelopment Authority and the Economic Development and Industrial Corporation of Boston. They do business together as the BPDA, and this Act actually formalizes that relationship, consolidating both of those two corporations with a single board, with a single mission. while preserving all of their community development tools. And while it's changing a lot in how Boston does business, there's a lot of things that are also staying the same that I want to make sure I mention. It doesn't change the way that planning gets done in the city or way development projects get done in the city. They still are done through what we call the Article 80 process. The BPDA board would remain the planning board for the city and would have the same members. So like I mentioned, the act was passed with overwhelming support of the city council in February. It's up at the State House now, and we're optimistic that it will pass in this session. So I thought I'd wrap up by giving you an example of where this might be actually put into practice. So here's a map of East Boston. You can see that East Boston is actually one of our most diverse, most dense communities. It's also one of our most threatened by sea level rise. So you can see the flood pathways here. And while there's an extreme threat from flooding, one of the things that is helpful about East Boston is that the flood incursion pathways are very clear. And if we can elevate just where those arrows are on the map, we can cut off a lot of the flood pathways and protect a lot of the neighborhood. And a lot of really exceptional planning work has already gone into this. There's been a lot of work by people that I'm sure are in this room or on the call today, envisioning how these elevations might be done in the community's interest, and deploy green infrastructure, as well as parks and open space. But when it comes to implementation, a major problem is that the property along the waterfront is held by several dozen different distinct private property owners. And of course needs to be a continuous flood elevation for this to actually work properly. So with our repurposed, re-envisioned urban renewal tools from the home rule petition, the city could have the powers it actually needs to put this idea into action. We could directly negotiate easement agreements with all the private property owners. In some cases, we may want to directly negotiate an acquisition of a piece of property for that green infrastructure you saw. Inward of that seawall, we might want to build, working with community development corporations, affordable housing, or to prevent East Bostonians from displacement. We might want to have a small business incubator or a space for legacy businesses. And we could even use tax assistance to help us finance all of this. So we're hopeful to be able to put that vision into action soon. But I wanted to close out today with a quote from Mayor Wu's State of the City, which helps sum up the new direction for the BPDA. And we're in the business of planning Boston's future and enabling growth. But Mayor Wu's challenged us to make sure we put people at the center of everything we do. So hopefully you see that our home rule petition does just that. It moves away from actions that once displaced people to actions that will now prevent displacement, really protect our communities, and respond to some of Boston's most pressing challenges. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Devin. You've got your work cut out for you over there, but I hope the legislature sees fit to give you this authority, and then we're excited to see what happens next. Now we're going to turn over to our moderated discussion, and for that, I'd like to introduce Joan Fitzgerald, Professor of Public Policy and Urban Affairs at Northeastern University. The focus of Joan's academic, teaching, and writing activities is urban climate action, and in particular, the link between economic development, sustainability, and equity. She's written many books on these topics and is co-author of the forthcoming Cities and the Struggle for Climate Justice. Most recently, Joan co-authored an op-ed in the Boston Globe arguing that Massachusetts needs a statewide coastal adaptation agency because we don't have governance and structures in place that allow our cities and towns to act effectively on their own, and regional collaboration is essential to face this challenge. So welcome, Joan, and welcome back to all our panelists. You guys can come up here and take your seats.
I started out with a list of questions for each speaker, but I've thrown that to the side. Deanna started this session saying that we need to have regional or state authority to really address resilience. And I think we've heard five fabulous presentations on different ways to do that in different political contexts. But what I saw in today's talk was 4 fundamental contradictions in what we're doing and about 5 key policy kind of decisions to make. So let me start with those and then move that into the questions for them. So the first one is overdevelopment versus retreat. We started today with a land recognition that we're on Native American property. And certainly Native Americans knew how to live in harmony with nature. We know how to develop and overdevelop, which has gotten us into the situation we're in. And so today I heard one person, Mark, mention managed retreat. Retreat did not come up in today's talks, yet we heard Dorchester County in Maryland will be half underwater by 2050. That Charles County has continued movement of people from Washington, D.C. to suburbanization. And we are sitting on the epitome of overdevelopment right here in the seaport. So the contradiction is we want to continue to overdevelop and plan in a way that allows us to continue doing that. Today's New York Times headline, top of the page, was Phoenix, which has the opposite problem with lack of water. And for the first time, they're going to have to tell developers, no, we can't do it because we don't have enough water. Now, we've known this for how long in the West, but it's the first time a decision has been made to not develop. So my question related to that to the panel is what role does retreat play in how you're thinking about resilience?
I'll start, I guess. Okay. Retreat. Thank you for bringing this up because I'm concerned about sea level rise, but I'm also gravely concerned, as I mentioned before, about destruction and loss of wetlands. And wetlands will actually retreat along with the water, which is both good and bad. So it's something that's on our minds constantly. In Maryland, we have what we call the critical area law that strongly protects the coastline 100 feet from the coastline, and then extra protections for 1,000 feet from the coastline, all ironically within the floodplain. So we're thinking about, I just had a conversation in the hallway about making sure people know when they're, for instance, buying a home, where that home will be 30 years from now. Is it going to be there or is it going to be a wetland? So I think we need to have that public awareness perspective. It's hard as a politician for me to say no a lot. And it's hard for me as a politician to tell a business or private landowner they can't do something with their property. So instead, we're trying an incentives-based approach. One tool of the Resilience Authority or something they are allowed to do in Maryland is to purchase excess property in those communities that are most burdened by flooding and utilize blue and green infrastructure to try to help mitigate some of that flooding. So that's a little bit of a retreat, instead of allowing it to be developed, it's a little bit of a retreat method. But beyond that, I think it's a difficult conversation to have in a capitalist society.
Bottom line answer, right?
We're going to have to figure it out, though.
Right. What?
Yeah, and I can approach that from a slightly different perspective too. One of the big problems is you come up very quickly with constitutional issues about takings. And so one of the things that we're trying to think about in Connecticut is trying to use, like I said earlier, those zoning tools that already exist. So things like transferable development rights, which is a way of preserving the value of a property, but severing the development rights from that property so that they could be sold and used in, say, another place that might be a less vulnerable area. So, that's something that we're thinking about in Connecticut. We have some statutory limitations with that, in that transfer development rights in Connecticut, while allowed by state law, have to be direct from the seller to the buyer, which doesn't allow that intermediary that could serve as, say, a bank for those development rights. And that's something the legislature, I'd love to see them think about that and take that up in the future, and that would make that a much more valuable tool. Transfer development rights have been used in Maryland to great effect in trying to think about those vulnerable areas, limit development in those areas, sever those development rights, and get people to use them in those I call them sending zones that are less vulnerable which would then give developers in those rights maybe some incentives or extra abilities beyond what's currently allowed in zoning. So that's one way to approach it without using those really scary words, managed retreat.
I want to take you up on recognizing where we are right now as we're having this conversation. And in addition to the land acknowledgement and the obviously substantial recent development in the seaport, another factor to lay on to that is the fact that this was once all tidal wetlands. There's a great map that I encourage you to all look up around what was historically Boston's footprint and where the shoreline was and what it is today. Boston reclaimed significant land from the sea in the starting out 1850s through the end of World War II, basically to create where most of Boston's footprint is today. So this is a problem of our own making. But I think I want to acknowledge if I said retreat was the solution, I'd probably have to take a one-way ferry out of here. I don't think I can say that in today's meeting, but I think we do need to look at that retreat does need to be on the table as we're looking at what the options are. And we also need to look back to the ecology of Boston Harbor and the fact that once there was great tidal wetlands that protected Greater Boston, and as we're thinking about what the infrastructure solutions that we want to put into place, we need to include green infrastructure and not just hard seawalls, because that's what's probably going to be the most effective in protecting us in the long term.
Anyone else want to speak to that?
You know, retreat came up in a different context for us in the 2017 fires and people's immediate desire to rebuild, and very much related to private property rights. And this is our home. We had the opportunity to be under 3 declared disasters at the same time: drought, fire, and then it flooded that winter as well in our county. So I don't know where we would retreat at that point because there's not a lot left. But I think it's not a policy discussion. It becomes a very personal discussion when you talk about retreat, and it becomes an equity issue big time. We're also seeing insurance companies retreat from California, and that's going to create other pressures on residents and businesses in the community. Having said all that, we do have an example of not quite retreat, but an adaptation. So the Russian River is the main waterway through Sonoma County, and it floods all the time. It has for years. I mean, climate change will make it worse, but it does it all the time. It did it so often that FEMA at one point told our county, no one can rebuild there unless they all elevate their homes, or no one can fix their homes. So the county had to decide whether to not allow people to rebuild or to institute new building requirements, and that's what they did. So now it looks like, the coast of the Gulf or something where everything's raised, and during most years it's okay, and then it floods every 3rd year and the homes are okay. Mm-hmm. I don't know, workarounds, I guess.
Yeah.
I would just add, I think it's inevitable, but agree with Suzanne on the very real and difficult conversations that it requires and the equity issues. But it is happening, and as Suzanne mentioned, in the wildfire context, but it's happening in the middle of the country as well, in riverine areas. And we just saw in Kentucky last year the devastating floods, and the community wants to move farther up the mountain. And so there's an inherent designed retreat strategy for them that the community has bought in on. It's interesting, and I'll probably not get all of the specifics, but in California, legislation actually passed to create a state revolving fund so that counties could buy homes from property owners, and the idea being that those property owners would rent the property until such time as it fell into the sea. Governor Newsom vetoed the legislation because there's just no way of knowing how large of a program you have to have in order to address all of those coastal needs. So it's an important piece of the discussion, but very difficult.
Yeah, and I think the Kentucky case, like Phoenix now, which was forced on them, finally realizing, okay, We can't have the response all the time that we're going to rebuild in the same places, whether it's Tornado Alley or hurricanes and whatever fires.
Actually, I'll just mention too, in the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act, there is actually $216 million through the Bureau of Indian Affairs to work with tribal nations to think about relocation. And so there's planning money and then actually money to move. And I think that was largely driven by Alaska Native corporations.
Okay. Let me go through the other three contradictions, and because they're all intertwined, and put them to you for discussion. And the second one is the public good versus private property rights. And you pointed out, Devin, how much property, and you have to get everyone to go along. That's just East Boston. We have 350 parcels on 47 miles of coastline in the city of Boston. And so without eminent domain, as you know, a taking, you've got to get agreement with all these property owners if you're going to build a resilient coastline that works. And so eventually, how far can we go with this without some kind of eminent domain? And that's not going to be a pretty struggle. The third contradiction is equity versus the interests of rich people. And we see that play out in a number of areas. So a lot of you spoke about very good efforts, urban heat islands to plant trees in frontline communities to build cooling centers, a step up, I think, in the BPDA plan to really connect that affordable housing issue. But you know, you talked about, some of you, taking the politics out of prioritizing what gets saved. I think that's very difficult to do, given the economic power that influences politics. And so, yes, we want to take these measures, but I'll point to Miami as a place where you see how this is going to play out. So historically, the coast, right? That's the expensive property. Poor people went to the higher elevations of the city of Miami. Well, now that calculus is starting to change, and you're seeing developers starting to buy up property in the higher elevations, the frontline communities of Miami, because that's going to be the area that's above sea level. And so how do you prevent that from playing out in your cities and states and regions? And the fourth one is urgency versus compromise. Everyone started with urgency and the need for it. Yet, I think it was Mark that said, start small, build momentum, identify the champions. That's a great process, and that's typically how it happens. But how much time do we have for that? Or even, in your discussions as well, in terms of the compromises you had to make to get this legislation passed. So I have policy debates too, but I'll let everyone respond to that, and then turn it over to the questions from the audience.
I'm happy to start. And those are all very big questions. I try to touch on all pieces of all of them with one theme. So one thing we're doing in Boston is it's sort of an internal strategy to on the point of urgency versus compromise, how we're going to get the right team of people focused on this. We've created an internal team that we're calling our Coastal Resilience Implementation Team, and this takes folks out of our environment department, the BPDA, folks in our construction units, integrates them with public works and water to other places, and that is one team of people that can wake up every day and say, my job is to figure out how to get this done, so that there is the urgency, but they also have to figure out how to do it for the long haul. Touching on prioritization, that team with a steering committee from our Planning and Advisory Council, which is all the cabinet chiefs of the built environment departments, will prioritize what the project list for Boston, and equity measures absolutely are part of that prioritization. And it's one of the reasons why East Boston is at the top of our priority environmental justice community and has such a tremendous threat. then to weave in the eminent domain theme, I mean, that we want to empower that team with the tools that I talked about. Eminent domain is a power that the BPDA has, that also the city of Boston has for open space acquisition. But I think our experience has been that that's not a very productive way to have a real estate conversation. It's a very productive way to end up in court over land costs, but it's a good, but having that tool in your back pocket is really what might force a conversation, but we need to have the tools to have a negotiation. Just a taking is not the right solution in those cases.
Okay.
So all of those things that you mentioned, I think the trend would lead to paralysis, right? Like what, well, why? We can't do it fast enough. We can't do it. So I think that's what we have to avoid, right? And what that means to me is you got to do some stuff. And is it going to be perfect? No. Is it going to fix all the things all at once? No. But it's just picking things off one at a time and trying things and being willing to look silly doing it sometimes or failing sometimes. But government's not great at that. We like to make sure everything is because we get taken to court a lot, and that's expensive. But I do think that's where, I don't know, we've got to have some leadership and momentum behind trying new things and recognizing this isn't a typical situation that we're in, that we're in deep trouble. So we need we need a variety of actions to get us out of it if we're going to get out of it. And we need to be nimble and flexible in doing that.
I'll say three things. I think the coordination is so important, and it seems like the simplest answer to so much of this, and yet on the list of things that government does horribly, coordination is one of them, particularly because we work in silos all the time. So particularly across state governments, and again, I mentioned all the departments that play a role, and how everything is so interconnected. We're really bad at forcing conversations and forcing coordination. And that doesn't even touch state government on down to local government. So really making sure that we're thinking through and empowering that coordination is important. On an equity lens, I mean, as I think the sole politician in the room, I'll just say that I'm incredibly proud Maryland has the most diverse General Assembly in our history, and that's exactly what a General Assembly should be. It should be a representation of the state. We have more people of color, more women, more people under 40 than we've ever had before. And I think that's led to the progress that you saw that I walked through and all of the legislative accomplishments in the last 5 years. And because of that representation, we are centering equity in almost every piece of legislation first and foremost. And that's how we're going to hopefully keep an eye on it throughout the policy framework. And lastly, on it, when it comes to taking and when it comes to private property rights, I kind of want all of us in government to maybe be a little more like FEMA and be a little more like the insurance companies. And I mean, if somebody doesn't want to play ball, if they don't want to be a part of the solution, it's not like the flood is going to recognize that ignorance. So if folks get flooded, as they inevitably will, we have to be a little harsher about our response to them, because every time my community experiences a flood, everybody wants disaster response funding immediately. And I have a lot of empathy for that. But at some point, if folks are not willing to play ball, I think we have to say, you had so many opportunities to be a part of the solution, we can't help you anymore. And I hate to say it might come down to that, but I think we all are realists, and it's got to come down to that, and we have to lose a little bit of empathy in that circumstance.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think strong cooperation and collaboration can really get to all of the things that you asked us about. And I just will speak quickly to the urgency and compromise. I think what we've seen here today through collaborations across regions has demonstrated how much can be achieved. We manage a network of climate collaboratives that have popped up around the country over the years, and folks are probably familiar with the Southeast Florida Climate Compact. It's been around for 15 years. There's the Mystic River Collaborative here locally. I'm always encouraging regional collaboratives to think, particularly now with all of the federal resources that are available, to look at those opportunities regionally, because each jurisdiction brings its own strengths. For very small jurisdictions that don't have staff who can write grants and the like, you can rely on the larger jurisdictions. And so I think that's how we're going to get through a lot of these challenges, that cooperation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think to the coordination aspect, I think that's why I kind of support a state agency approach, but it's really been good to hear the combination of those factors that you've been putting in place. And I make these contradictions, I point them out not in the context because I think we're all set up pretty well politically and the states represented here, but I follow Austin a lot. And so you have a state legislature that says, not only are we not going to deal with this, but we're going to preempt cities from doing just about anything. And Texas is not an outlier in that regard. So being in a state where everyone's pretty much on the same page is just a really amazing advantage. So let's open it up to the audience.
Could I actually just put on the point about politics and red and blue states?
Yeah.
Actually, it's been said, and the senator mentioned, on the resilience authorities in particular, it's been easy to find bipartisan support. And I do think within the broader climate challenges, adaptation and resilience really has been nonpartisan. And you see states like Florida, very Republican legislature, Republican governor, South Carolina, Republican majorities, creating chief resilience officer positions in the governor's office. And in South Carolina particularly, really heavily resourcing that office. And so I think there are some red states, I think, that are working cooperatively with their local.
Absolutely, and their economy, it's essential to their economy to do so, right?
So I would like to field a question from the chat, as this has been a very active chat. So thank you for all of the great participation to our virtual attendees. Also, thank you to our in-person attendees for bearing with our panelists without mics. This is to cater to our virtual attendees, so we really appreciate that. And sorry if it's a little hard to hear people in the back. But I'm picking a question which hopefully involves commentary from all of our speakers and panelists today, which is, has any community taken an approach of a betterment district rather than eminent domain?
So I can speak to a Boston example of that. So the BPDA is a major real estate owner in the city of Boston, and we have two very large contiguous areas where we own property. One is just down the street from here, the Raymond L. Flynn Marine Park, and another is the Charlestown Navy Yard. Both were former Army and Navy bases that closed in Boston. So, and we've been redeveloping both through ground leases. The redevelopment of the Marine Park is relatively recent and something we put into place 2 years ago as the landlord of the property. Is a requirement in all of our leases that the tenants reimburse the city for a pro rata per square foot their share of any resilience investments that the city makes. It's just the city's dollars. So if we get dollars from the feds and the states, whatever, they don't have to reimburse those. But any city dollars that are put into the Marine Park, that each tenant will pay their portion. And we negotiated this not as a tax, but as a, you're going to help. You're going to commit to this, but only after you see the benefit, so that maybe we can borrow some funds against that commitment and get that investment done more quickly. And we did that because we were the landlord, and we had the ability to negotiate that. But we also did it because we wanted to show what the concept of a bid for climate resilience might look like and how it might work. So we'd love to see that concept moved onto private property in the future.
And the city of New Haven in Connecticut has been working on a redevelopment project for the Long Wharf district, and they have a very active and progressive planning department in the city of New Haven. And I think one of the options that they're looking at is creating a resilience overlay zone to cover that area, which would allow there to be some zoning specificity just for that particular area. And that may be getting at a little bit what you're talking about there. Okay, good. We have like 3 minutes left, so let's go with one question in here.
Hi, this has been fantastic. I also I was thinking about another contradiction on Ms. Fitzgerald's point of we have new governance ideas versus governmental craft that we haven't really looked at. You know, we've seen a lot of cross-governmental organizations. We've seen a lot of quasi-governmental organizations. We've seen a lot of getting around procurement law. But what about changing that procurement law? What about raising, say, $1 billion from the state, however we do that? Or having the government show up to some planning board with a proverbial gun and saying, get this done. We haven't really thought about like what's there to do with in terms of existing governmental organizations and making them work better.
I think that every level of government is woefully unprepared to deal with the climate threats.
So why not change it all?
Exactly. Why not? So what would a better governmental structure look like? And I think it's at least beginning by thinking of breaking down the silos. It's interesting to me, I'm on an advisory group for the state of New Jersey that's putting together a heat plan. And it started off and folks from the Department of Environment went to each of the state agencies and said, what is your role in extreme heat? And not every agency came back with anything that they could contribute to addressing extreme heat, which is shocking to me because every aspect of government is getting touched by extreme heat. And their Department of Education is one that came back without any ideas about what to deal with heat. So, and you can go down the list. Their Department of State manages the Office of Tourism. What are you going to do with tourists who are coming into New Jersey? So it's a great question. I think we're at this incredible moment in time where we do need to think about climate in every aspect of how government operates. And some places are doing that better than others. Here in the Commonwealth, you know, Governor Healy on day one appointed Melissa Hoffer as the climate czar. That's a start to really start shaking down what state agencies are doing and what their contributions are. But it's going to take us all, and not just people in government. It's everyone that government works with.
So we can't really touch our constitutions beyond, you know, referendums and things like that, and votes. But first and foremost, my role in the State Senate of Maryland is I'm an appropriator. I serve on our Budget and Taxation Committee. I chair a subcommittee that controls about 1/3 of the state budget, including in all the environmental departments. And so I've utilized my gavel as a way of ensuring accountability. And the legislature's a natural check on the executive branch. So we actually convened a special hearing of just of the agencies that touch resilience on resilience. And we actually forced them all to sit at the table, Department of Transportation, Environment, Department of Energy, and for the first time ever, tell us how much money they are spending on resiliency and how much money they need. And I think that's just an approach that it's really difficult for government agencies to say how much money they need to fulfill their mission or solve a problem because they're constantly told by governors that you need to keep your costs the same because we're not going to raise taxes. So I've kind of flipped that and I'm demanding every secretary that comes to my budget hearing, tell me what you need. Maybe I can get it to you, maybe I can't, but we're not going to solve this problem pretending like the resources we're dedicating are enough. I think make money grow on trees, but we need to have an honest conversation about the delta between where the state is and where we need to go.
Great responses. I mean, you all as a panel have raised such important issues on whether it's city, county, state, some combination of it, whether you have an agency that's focused on coastal resilience versus like your case in Sonoma, you don't have the privilege of just isolating all those aspects of resilience. Nature-based versus hard infrastructure. And then, of course, the big issue, of course, behind all of it all is funding. But it certainly has given us a lot to think about. So thank you very much.
So I'm just here to close out our program for today, and thank you to all of our amazing speakers for being here, for your presentations, for this wonderful panel discussion. Thank you to the co-chairs who put together this wonderful program, and to the EBC leadership and staff for all of their hard work to make this event flow as beautifully as it did today. Thank you to our steering committee, the Climate Adaptation Forum Steering Committee, and of course to all of our sponsors and to our supporters. Before you go, whether you're virtual or in person, have received a survey. It'll be a link in your chat if you're online, and it'll be a little blue paper if you're in the room right now. Please take a moment to fill this out. It's a very quick survey, but we take your feedback very seriously, and we use it to plan all of our future events. So if you have ideas about what you'd like us to see talk about in the future, if you have feedback about what could have gone better today, or you just want to write, "Y'all rock, this is awesome," all of those things are great. Please, please, please fill it out. Also, keep in touch with us. There will be another forum in September. I believe we don't yet have a date for that. Is that correct? No date. But it is in September probably. So more information coming on that soon. Thank you all for being here today in person and virtually. We're really happy that you took the time to spend with us today, and I hope this was a very wonderful forum for you as well. Have a wonderful weekend.